It was a night when the wind whispered through the narrow alleys of the tiny medieval village, carrying with it the scent of burning wood and damp earth. The moon, shrouded behind thick grey clouds, cast a pale diffused glow over the snow-laden, thatched roofs, making them glisten like the backs of silver-scaled fish. The air was thick with silence, broken only by the faint crackling of a dying fire, or the occasional shuffle of footsteps as someone stirred in the cold. Inside a small, crooked cottage on the edge of the village, Thomas the peasant huddled closer to his family. They sat on a rough wool blanket near the hearth, their faces flushed from the heat of the flames, but their backs chilled by the draught seeping through the cracks in the walls. The fire had been burning all day, fed by small twigs and the last bits of dried peat, but as the night deepened, the flames weakened, and the chill returned with a vengeance. Thomas sighed, his breath a mist in the frigid air. He knew this night was far from over, and survival was a test of patience, grit, and sheer willpower. The wind howled outside, and the walls creaked under the weight of the snow. The wooden beams, darkened with smoke and soot, seemed to groan in protest, as if the very house itself were tired of fighting the cold. "Papa, will the fire last till morning?" asked little Alice, her voice barely a whisper. Thomas looked down at her, her small frame wrapped in a thin shawl, her cheeks rosy from the fire's warmth. He smiled faintly, though worry danced behind his eyes. "We'll make it last, child," he said softly, pulling her closer. The family had long learned the art of conserving every ember. Before nightfall, Thomas had stacked the few remaining logs near the hearth, carefully rationing the wood to stretch through the endless hours of darkness. The nights were treacherous in winter. Food was scarce. The livestock shivered in the barns, and the thought of frost creeping into the bones was a fear that lurked in every villager's mind. Outside, the snow piled higher, and the world seemed to shrink under the heavy blanket of white. The thatched roof groaned under the weight, and Thomas worried whether it would hold. It was patched together with straw and mud, and he had seen the storm coming in the skies, darkening hues that afternoon. But there was no choice. The peasant's life was one of survival. Day by day, night by night, the warmth of the fire began to wane, and Thomas rose, wrapping a thin wool cloak around his shoulders. He moved carefully, so as not to wake the others. By the fire, he added a small handful of dried twigs, coaxing the flames to life. A weak flicker ignited, casting shadows on the walls. He exhaled, watching his breath rise in the dim light. He knew that even a small flame could mean the difference between life and death on nights like this. Outside, in the village square, the sound of a distant bell echoed a low, somber tone. That signaled the change of the watch. Someone else, perhaps in a home just like Thomas's, was also huddled close to their fire, praying for warmth, for survival, for another dawn. As the hours stretched on, Thomas dozed lightly, waking every so often to check the fire. Each time, he adjusted the wood, repositioned the blankets, and ensured that his children stayed warm. The smallest details mattered, tucking in the edges of the blankets to keep drafts out, using stones warmed by the fire at their feet, and huddling together to share body heat. The art of survival wasn't just in fighting the cold, it was in understanding it, respecting its power, and learning to live within its limits. Thomas knew this. His father had taught him, and his father before him. And so the night wore on, long and cold, but not without hope. Because even in the darkest nights of the medieval world, there was always the promise of morning, of light returning, and of life continuing, one breath, one flickering flame at a time. As dawn approached, the dark sky over the village began to fade into a soft, muted blue. The snow outside shimmered faintly under the first hints of light, but the air remained biting cold. Inside the small timber-framed cottage, the family stirred. The fire, now a quiet bed of glowing embers, had managed to keep them through the long hours of the night. The hearth small, humble, and the heart of the home was their lifeline. Thomas blinked, his tired eyes open. The chill in the air nipped at his skin, but he felt a quiet sense of relief. They had survived another night. The ancient knowledge of their ancestors had guided them. Never let the fire die. It was a simple lesson, but one etched deep in their lives, passed from one generation to the next. Beside him, his wife, Mary, slowly unwrapped the shawl from around their youngest child. The baby's soft breaths were slow and steady, a sign that warmth had done its magic. Mary's hands, though cracked and reddened from the cold, moved with practiced care. She knew the rhythm of these long winters, the careful tending of the fire, the layering of clothes, the little tricks to trap heat where there was so little of it. Thomas stood and gently stretched. The beams above his head creaked, and a bit of snow fell from the thatch into a wooden bucket below. He picked up a small iron poker and stirred the coals. A faint flicker of flame danced back to life. He fed it with thin sticks of kindling, watching as the flame grew small, delicate, yet full of hope. This was the art of survival, knowing how much to give the fire so it lived through the night, but not so much that you wasted precious fuel. Mary began to prepare a thin porridge from the last bits of oats. The smell was faint, but comforting. It was a reminder that the simplest of meals, when shared together, could feel like a feast. The children, still wrapped in blankets, watched with wide eyes as steam rose from the pot. Their bellies rumbled, but no one complained. In the peasant's world, hunger was a constant companion, but so was resilience. As Thomas sipped the warm broth, he thought of the world beyond the cottage walls. He knew that across the village, other families were doing the same, tending fires, holding on to warmth, whispering quiet prayers for strength. It was not an easy life, but it was the only one they knew. The land itself was harsh in winter. Fields lay dormant, the earth frozen and unyielding. Livestock huddled together in barns, their breath visible in the cold. Every day was a calculation. How much food to spare, how much wood to burn, how much energy to spend. Survival wasn't just about enduring the cold, it was about patience, foresight, and a quiet, persistent hope that spring would come. Thomas's thoughts wandered back to his childhood. He remembered nights when his father told him stories by the fire tales of ancestors who had survived even harsher winters, who had built their homes with stronger hands and warmer hearts. Those stories were as much a part of the fire as the wood itself. They kept the mind alive while the body shivered. Outside, the snow had stopped falling, but the sky remained grey. Thomas knew the day ahead would be cold, but they would manage, just as they always did. He smiled gently at Mary, who offered him a small piece of bread. It was rough, nearly stale, but it was enough. They ate slowly, savoring every bite, letting the warmth of the food sink into their bones. The fire crackled softly, a reminder of the night they had survived, and the day they would now face. And so, as the sun crept higher, weak and pale, Thomas and his family prepared for another day in their quiet, resilient life. The cold was a constant companion, but they had each other, and the hearth's glow a small, flickering light in a world of winter grey. The cold was more than just a season in the medieval world. It was a test of patience, of skill, of endurance. And in this quiet test, the simplest things often made the greatest difference. For the peasants who lived in small wooden cottages, their secret weapon against the cold wasn't just the fire in the hearth, but the clothes they wore, in the faint grey light of morning. Mary sat by the fire, slowly pulling on her woolen stockings. The wool, coarse and scratchy, was far from the soft fabrics of the nobility, but it was a gift. It trapped heat like a hidden treasure, keeping her legs from going numb in the chill of the day. She carefully wrapped a second layer around her shoulders, a simple shawl, woven by her mother, patched and repaired more times than she could count. It smelled of smoke, of earth, of family. Thomas, too, layered his clothes with care. A linen tunic, worn thin from years of use, sat close to his skin. Over it, a thicker woolen tunic, its edges frayed. Then a cloak, heavy and dark, fastened with a simple wooden clasp. Every layer was a barrier against the biting air, a shield, woven from the patience and labor of many hands. The children giggled softly as they bundled into their layers. Their tiny fingers fumbled with laces, and Mary helped them, her own fingers stiff with cold. The youngest, little Anna, wore a hat too big for her head, the floppy wool falling over her eyes. They laughed, a sound that echoed gently through the small room, warming it in ways the fire never could. It wasn't just the clothes, it was how they wore them. Wool next to the skin, to trap warmth. Linen as a soft buffer. Cloaks to shield against the wind. Straw stuffed into shoes for insulation. Gloves made from old cloth, patched and stitched until they barely held together. Every piece told a story of survival, the mended sleeves, the stretched out hems, the buttons replaced with bits of bone or wood. Thomas remembered the wisdom of the elders, how they spoke of the three-layer rule. One to hold in body heat, one to insulate, and one to block the wind. He thought of his grandfather's stories, of how they learned to wrap cloth around their legs and tuck it tight. How they wore caps, even indoors, to keep heat from escaping their heads. The cold was clever. It found its way in through the smallest gaps, under the door, through the cracks in the walls, around the edges of sleeves. But the peasants were clever too. They knew how to plug the gaps, how to trap body heat, how to keep moving. Even when their breath hung in the air like fog, they kept their spirits strong, because they knew the secret survival was a habit, not a miracle. Mary set a pot of water on the fire to warm, and the children sat close, wrapping their cloaks around their knees. They spoke softly, their voices gentle in the quiet room. The layers they wore were not just for warmth, they were armor against the world outside. A protection that let them face the harsh winds and bitter nights. As the day crept on, Thomas pulled on his heavy boots, the soles worn thin from years of walking. He laced them up tight, stuffing bits of old cloth inside to block out the chill. The snow outside had settled into a thick, icy crust. He knew that the layers they wore would be the difference between comfort and misery, between health and sickness. When they finally stepped outside, the world greeted them with a sharp, cold breath. But wrapped in their layers, they felt ready. They walked slowly, carefully, the snow crunching underfoot. The sky was pale, almost white, and the bare trees stood like silent guardians. Watching over them, they were just peasants, just a small family in a small village. But they carried with them the quiet knowledge of generations. Layer by layer, step by step, they could endure the coldest of winters, and so, As the day unfolded, they went about their tasks, feeding animals, fetching water, tending the fire. The layers they wore were their silent armor, holding them together, keeping the cold at bay, whispering to them that spring would come. Eventually, the clothes may have been rough, worn, and patched, but they were enough. They were always enough. In the heart of the medieval winter, when frost etched silver lines across the windows, and the breath of each villager hung like mist in the air, the warmth of a good meal could make the difference between hope and despair. Food wasn't just fuel for the body, it was comfort, connection, and sometimes even a reason to keep going. In the small, dimly lit cottage, Mary stirred a bubbling pot over the fire. The air inside was thick with the smell of stewing vegetables, a simple, yet hearty blend of cabbage, onions, and a few precious root vegetables they had stored from the harvest. The stew was thin, but it filled the air with an earthy warmth, promising a brief escape from the bitter cold that clawed at the door. Thomas entered the room, stomping the snow off his boots. His cheeks were flushed red from the wind, and his fingers stiff from the cold. He glanced at the pot and smiled faintly. A warm millet wasn't much, but it was enough to lift the spirits. The children gathered around the hearth, their eyes bright despite the chill. Little Anna leaned against her brother, her hands cupped around a wooden bowl. The steam rose, fragrant and inviting, as they sipped the broth slowly, savoring each spoonful like it was a treasure. For peasants like them, meals were never extravagant. Meat was rare, reserved for special days, or when the village caught a rabbit or a hen. Most days, they relied on what the earth provided: barley, beans, lentils, cabbage, leeks, and the occasional turnip. They knew how to stretch their supplies, to turn a handful of ingredients into a meal that could fill the belly and warm the bones. Mary's stew was a reflection of this simple wisdom. She had learned from her mother, who had learned from her mother before. A pinch of salt, a splash of vinegar, and patience, always patience. The stew had to simmer slowly, the flavors blending over hours, filling the house with a comforting scent that made the cold feel a little less cruel. Bread, too, was a lifeline. Coarse and dark, baked in a communal oven, the loaves were dense, with grains, and sometimes mixed with dried peas or beans to stretch the flour. Each slice was precious, often dipped into the stew, or spread with a thin layer of lard when it was available. The children sometimes crumbled the bread into their bowls, making a thick, warming porridge that could sustain them through the long nights. On some days, when fortune smiled, they might have a piece of cheese, aged and sharp, or a bit of dried fruit saved from autumn. These small treats were celebrated, their taste lingering on the tongue long after the meal was finished. A single apple, carefully stored in straw, could brighten an entire day. Thomas remembered the old stories, told by the elders of times when the winter was so harsh that even the bark of trees was boiled to make a thin broth. But he also remembered the resilience of the people, how they shared what they had, how a neighbor's extra carrot or a friend's bit of salt could make a meal feel like a feast. Mary ladled out another serving, her hands steady despite the chill. The fire cracked and popped, casting a warm glow on their faces. They ate slowly, savoring each bite, each sip, as if it were the last. Conversation was soft, words murmured between spoonfuls. They talked about the day, about the snow outside, about the animals in the barn. The children asked questions in hushed voices. Would the snow melt soon? Would the geese lay eggs again when spring came? Mary answered them gently, her voice a soft lullaby weaving through the air, calming their restless thoughts. After the meal, Thomas leaned back, his eyes half closed, feeling the warmth spread through his limbs. He watched the children curl up by the hearth, their bellies full, their breathing slow and even. The world outside was cold and dark, but inside the cottage there was light, warmth, and the quiet satisfaction of a meal well made. The simple act of eating together, of sharing the same food from the same pot, was a reminder that they were not alone in the struggle. They were a family, a community, bound together not by wealth or power, but by the quiet moments of care and the shared determination to see another day as the night deepened. Mary tidied the bowls, carefully scraping every last bit of stew into her own bowl. She ate slowly, feeling the heat settle in her belly, a small flame of comfort against the darkness. Thomas added another log to the fire, the flames dancing in the dim light. The children yawned, their eyes heavy with sleep. They nestled together under blankets, the warmth of the meal lingering in their bodies, softening the harsh edges of the world. Outside, the wind howled, the snow falling in silent waves, but inside, the family was wrapped in a cocoon of care, their hearts full from a simple meal, and as they drifted off to sleep, their dreams carried them to warmer days, to the smell of fresh bread baking in the oven, to the taste of ripe berries in summer, to the feeling of the sun on their faces. In the quiet of the night, the memory of that meal, of that small moment of comfort, glowed like a soft lantern in the dark, guiding them gently into rest. Because in the end, it wasn't just food they shared, it was love, hope, and the quiet strength to face whatever tomorrow might bring. Asterisk, the nights in the medieval village were cold-boned deep, finger-numbing cold that crept through the tiniest cracks and seemed to seep into your very soul. The wind howled like a restless spirit, rattling shutters and whispering through the thatch. It was a cold that could steal your breath if you weren't careful, a cold that didn't just bite your skin, but gnawed at your hope. Yet, amidst all this, the villagers had their wise small rituals, little tricks, and the quiet resilience of hearts that had known winter's grip before. Mary, wrapped in a rough woolen shawl, sat by the fire, her fingers busy with a needle and thread. She was patching an old tunic, one that had seen many winters. The fabric was thin in places, worn by time, but every stitch she added was a small act of defiance, a reminder that they would endure. The fire crackled softly, sending flickers of light across the rough stone walls. The room was dim, the air tinged with smoke, but it was warmer here than anywhere else. Thomas came in, shaking the snow from his cloak. His hands were red, the tips of his fingers stiff with cold. He rubbed them together briskly, then held them close to the fire, sighing. As the warmth slowly returned, the children were already huddled under a pile of blankets. Their small bodies nestled close for shared warmth. Layering, this was the key to survival in these cold months. The villagers knew it instinctively, passed down from generation to generation. They wore linen shirts under wool tunics, cloaks over shawls, and sometimes even scraps of fur or leather, stitched together from whatever the village could spare. It wasn't about fashion or comfort, it was about survival. A thick outer layer to block the wind, a soft inner layer to trap body heat, and whatever else they could find in between. Mary's mother had taught her the importance of wool. "Wool holds the heat," she used to say, wrapping a scarf snugly around Mary's neck. And she was right. Woolen socks, hand-knitted mittens, and even felted hats became treasures in the winter. Handed down like heirlooms, mended over and over until they could no longer hold a stitch. Thomas helped Anna pull on another pair of stockings, her tiny toes pale and cold. She giggled, wriggling as the wool tickled her skin. It was a small sound of joy in the stillness of the night, a reminder that even in hardship, there could be laughter. Outside, the wind moaned through the bare trees, and the snow fell in a steady, silent curtain. The animals in the barn huddled together, 2 cows with their breath misting in the cold, chickens fluffing their feathers, and the old sheep curling close, their wool a natural shield against the frost. The villagers shared tip secrets whispered between mothers at the well or by the hearth. Wrap straw in your shoes. It keeps the cold from biting your feet. Sleep close together, as close as you can. Place warm stones at the foot of the bed, wrapped in cloths. They'll hold the heat through the night. These weren't luxuries. They were lifelines. The kind of knowledge that came from living in a world where nature was both a giver and a taker. Even the houses were built for warmth in mind. The low ceilings helped trap the heat from the fire, the thick thatch acting as insulation. Windows, were small and shuttered tight at night to keep the cold out. Sometimes, if a family had a cow or two, they might even bring them inside the main room during the harshest storms. Their body heat adding precious warmth to the air. The fire was the heart of it all. It wasn't just a place for cooking, it was life itself. Every day, someone had to tend to it, to coax it to life in the morning and feed it throughout the day. A dying fire meant a freezing night. Mary often stayed up late, poking the embers, adding sticks and scraps to keep it alive. She would wrap a shawl tightly around her shoulders, her face flushed from the heat, her fingers sooty, but the glow of the fire was a comfort like no other. Thomas would sometimes sing soft songs by the fire, old ballads from the village. Stories of knights and kings, of lost loves and battles long past. His voice was rough but gentle, and it lulled the children into sleep. They would drift off under their layers, their dreams warm and safe. Even as the wind rattled the shutters and the snow piled higher against the door, Mary would watch them, her heart full and aching all at once. They were safe for now. Tomorrow might bring more snow, or a sick animal, or a broken roof, but tonight they had warmth. They had each other. As the night deepened, the cottage quieted, the fire burning low but steady. Outside, the world was wrapped in a blanket of white, silent and still. The cold was relentless, but inside, there was a glow, a flicker of hope, of family, of love, woven into every stitch of a patched tunic, every spoonful of soup, every shared blanket. This was survival, not just of the body, but of the spirit. It was knowing that no matter how long the winter, spring would come. It was the faith that together they could endure, that warmth could be found not just in fire and wool, but in the quiet presence of those you loved. And so, wrapped in layers of cloth and care, they slept safe, warm, and dreaming of the sun's return in the stillness of a medieval village winter. Illness was as much a part of life as the cold itself. The air, thick with smoke from hearth fires, seemed to weigh heavy with the quiet sighs of those in pain. It wasn't just the chill that crept into bones. It was the coughs that rattled in the chest, the fevers that burned brighter than any hearth, and the quiet, anxious whispers of prayers offered to the heavens above. Mary had known the weight of these nights. Her grandmother had been the village healer, an old woman with hands that smelled of herbs and smoke, a mind filled with knowledge passed down through generations. Even after her passing, Mary still carried fragments of that knowledge, though never quite enough to feel sure. But in the cold nights, when a child's breath came in ragged gasps, she did what she could. The cottage, dimly lit by the fire's glow, became a place of quiet urgency. Thomas held their son, little Edward, who was flushed and burning with fever. Mary moved swiftly, her hand steady even as her heart raced. She rummaged through her small basket of herbs. Dried chamomile for calming, willow bark for the pain, elderflower for fever. She whispered under her breath, half a prayer, half a reminder of the old ways. They believed in humors, the balance of elements within the body: hot, cold, wet, dry. Too much heat, the fever raged. Too much cold, the shivers took hold. The cure, they thought, lay in restoring balance. Mary soaked a cloth in cool water, wrung it out, and laid it gently across Edward's forehead. His skin was hot, his breath shallow, but the touch seemed to soothe him. In the corner, a small pot of water warmed over the fire, infused with herbs. The scent filled the room, sharp, earthy, a reminder of summer's green in the depths of winter. Mary fed him small sips, her fingers brushing his flushed cheek, whispering encouragement. The medicine was simple, born from the land, a tea of yarrow and mint, a poultice of mashed garlic for the chest, a salve of honey and thyme for the throat. Outside, the wind howled, and the snow pressed in against the walls. But inside, they fought back against the cold and the sickness with whatever they had. Sometimes, Mary would close her eyes and remember her grandmother's voice. The body heals in its own time, but we can help it along. Keep them warm, give them water, let the herbs do their work, and, above all, stay close. Staying close, this was the heart of it all. In the depths of night, when Edward coughed and whimpered, Mary would hold him close, feeling his fever against her chest, whispering lullabies until his breathing evened out. Thomas sat nearby, adding wood to the fire, keeping the room as warm as they could. There was a rhythm to these nights: boiling water, tending the sick, whispering prayers, watching the slow return of color to a child's cheeks. But not all illnesses could be soothed by herbs and warmth. The village had seen its share of losses: babies who never woke, mothers who wasted away, elders who slipped quietly into the next world. Each loss left a hollow ache, a reminder that even the strongest wills and the best herbs could not always hold back the tide. Still, they tried. The healer's basket was a symbol of hope, a small thing, woven from reeds. But inside it were the tools of survival: sprigs of rosemary for memory, lavender for calming, sage for cleansing, comfrey for wounds. The knowledge was incomplete. The cure's often a matter of faith as much as fact. But they did what they could. On the coldest nights, Mary would mix a small bundle of herbs and hang it above the door, protection against sickness. They believed a talisman to keep the dark spirits at bay. Whether it was the herbs or the faith that helped, she couldn't say, but it was a comfort. Sometimes the village priest would come, his hands cold from the snow, offering prayers over the sick. His words were soft, his voice low, and while he spoke of heaven and mercy, Mary focused on the simple acts: warming broth, rubbing a back, soothing a fever. Faith and care worked side by side, each with its own quiet power. By morning, Edward's fever had broken. He lay asleep, his breathing slow and steady, his cheeks still pale, but no longer flushed with heat. Mary sat beside him, exhausted, but relieved, her hands resting on the quilt. The fire burned low, casting long shadows across the room. Thomas placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, and she leaned into him, both of them silently grateful. In the world outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the village in silence. The cold remained, and sickness would return, as it always did. But for now, they had a moment of peace, a pause in the struggle, a reminder that they could endure. This was life in the medieval village, a dance with the elements, a battle against illness, a constant tending to the fragile flame of life. And while they could not cure every sickness, they could offer warmth, care, and love, gifts as vital as any herb in the basket. As the night faded into a pale winter dawn, Mary whispered a quiet prayer, thanking her grandmother, the herbs, the fire, and the simple will to keep going. They had survived the night, they would survive the next. And in the end, perhaps that was the greatest medicine of all. The coldest months in the medieval countryside wrapped the world in stillness, as if the land itself had fallen asleep beneath a blanket of snow. The fields, once golden with wheat and barley, now lay bare and silent, their frozen soil unyielding to even the most determined hand. For the peasants, life in these months was a constant, quiet struggler, battle not with swords or shields, but with hunger, fatigue, and the slow gnawing of time. In a small thatched cottage, at the edge of the village, Thomas stirred the last pot of stew. The fire crackled softly, casting warm light across the rough wooden walls. But the pot itself seemed reluctant, bubbling only in thin, meager spurts. The stew was a simple affair, a handful of barley, a few shriveled carrots, wild herbs gathered before the frost, and the smallest pieces of salted pork leftovers from the last slaughter. Mary sat nearby, mending an old blanket, her needle moving slowly through the worn fabric. Her hands were red and raw from the cold, but she worked with quiet determination, glancing every so often at the pot. Little Edward, barely 5 years old, lay curled by the hearth, his cheeks pale but warm, his breath soft and steady. Will there be enough for tomorrow? Mary asked softly, her voice barely a whisper in the dim light. Thomas hesitated. He stirred the pot again, watching as the thin broth barely covered the barley. We'll make do, he said, though the words carried more hope than certainty. In the medieval village, survival depended on the harvest stand. When the harvest was poor, so too was the winter. Their diet in the harshest months was plain, born of necessity and scarcity. Bread, made from coarse rye or barley, was the backbone of every meal. The loaves, baked in communal ovens, were dark and dense, their crusts thick and hard. Fresh vegetables were a luxury, long since stored away or consumed. Instead, they relied on preserved goods, onions braided and hung from the rafters, beans dried and stored in sacks, root vegetables buried in the cold ground. For protein, they turned to salted meats, though such provisions were rare. The village pigs, fattened in the warmer months, had been slaughtered at Martinmas in November, their meat salted and hung in the cool air. Each piece was precious, doled out carefully, often only in the thinnest slivers, to flavor a pot of pottage. Eggs were scarce in winter, as the hens stopped laying, and milk from the cows slowed with the cold. The hearth became the heart of survival. Here, stews simmered slowly, stretching the meager ingredients into meals that could feed a family. The pottage was a staple, a thick hearty dish of grains, legumes, and whatever scraps of meat or vegetable could be spared. It was simple, filling, and warming, though by the end of winter, the same flavors grew monotonous, the taste of hunger dulling even the most familiar foods. On special occasions, if luck was on their side, there might be a treat, a pie filled with dried fruits, if any had been saved from the summer, or a piece of cheese, sharp and tangy, made from the last of the milk. Honey, when available, was a rare delight, though more often it was reserved for medicine or the priest's table. Foraging in winter was a quiet, patient art. Mary sometimes walked the frozen paths in search of whatever the land might still offer. Wild garlic peeking through the frost, the last stubborn rosehips clinging to bare branches, or the bitter leaves of dandelion nestled in the snow. Each find was small, but in a season of scarcity, even a few green leaves could bring relief. The village itself shared in the hardship. Neighbors might trade dried beans for a few eggs, a slice of bacon for a sack of grain. They helped each other where they could, though everyone had little to spare. The wealthier villagers, those who owned more land or had stored greater harvests, might offer gifts of food to the poorer families, though often at a price, whether in labor, loyalty, or gratitude. At night, the cold seemed to seep into the very bones. Thomas and Mary would lie close under the blankets, Edward nestled between them, their breath mingling in the darkness. Their stomachs grumbled softly, but they held each other, finding comfort in the warmth of shared bodies and whispered hopes. The cycle of hunger shaped their lives. In the heart of winter, there was always the quiet question: would the stores last? Would they make it to spring? Each day that passed brought them a little closer to the first signs of thaw, the drip of melting snow, the pale shoots of green. But until then, they endured, finding small joys in a warm hearth, a shared meal, and the love that carried them through. As the fire burned low and the stew was ladled into wooden bowls, Mary smiled at Thomas, a soft, tired smile that spoke of resilience and quiet strength. They would eat together, and they would survive, as countless generations before them had done, in the quiet of the night. With the snow falling softly outside, the peasants of the medieval village dreamed of warmer days and fuller tables. They knew the cold would pass, as it always did, and until then, they held fast to the simple comforts of food, family, and faith. In the dead of winter, when the winds howled through the trees like a restless spirit and the snow lay thick and unyielding across the land, warmth became a precious commodity. The hearth was the heart of the home, but for many peasants, wood was scarce, and fires could only burn for so long. To survive the long cold nights, they relied on methods passed down through generations: quiet, simple tricks born out of necessity and ingenuity. In the dim light of the cottage, Thomas sat by the hearth, the fire reduced to a faint glow of embers. His hands rubbed together for warmth, while Mary busied herself, spreading fresh straw across the floor. It wasn't much, but it was a trick her mother had taught her. Lay a thick layer of straw beneath the blankets, and it would help trap the heat, keeping the cold from seeping through the cracks in the floor. "Will it be enough?" Thomas asked, his voice soft and laced with fatigue. Mary nodded. "It's what we have, it's what they've always done." The thatched roof above creaked under the weight of the snow. Outside, the wind blew in low, mournful sighs, rattling the shutters and slipping through the gaps in the walls. It was a sound the peasants knew well, a reminder that the cold was always waiting just beyond their door. To keep warm without a roaring fire, they layered everything they had. Clothes were worn in pairs or even triples. Woolen tunics over linen shirts, cloaks patched and mended until they were little more than layers of cloth stitched together. Feet were wrapped in rags before being slipped into wooden clogs, and hands were kept inside sleeves or tucked beneath blankets. At night, families huddled together, sharing warmth beneath coarse woolen covers, their breath mingling in the chilly air. The cottage itself was designed with warmth in mind, though it offered little in the way of comfort by modern standards. The walls were thick, made of wattle and daub, sometimes reinforced with stones. Gaps were stuffed with straw, cloth, or even mud to block the wind. Windows, if they existed at all, were small and covered with oiled cloth or animal skins to let in light without letting out the heat. The hearth was carefully managed. The fire could not burn all night. Wood was too precious for that. Instead, they banked the fire at night, covering it with ashes to keep it smoldering until morning. If the fire went out, it could be a struggle to relight it, especially if flint and tinder were in short supply. So they treated it as a treasure, a fragile thread connecting them to survival. Sometimes they used heated stones. These were placed in the fire during the day, then wrapped in cloth and brought to bed at night, offering a brief but welcome warmth. They also relied on body heat, pressing close together, parents, children, sometimes even animals beneath. The blankets. The bed itself was often a simple wooden frame, or even a pile of straw in a corner. Straw mattresses were common, though they flattened over time and had to be refreshed. The bedding was sparse: rough spun sheets, wool blankets, and heavy cloaks layered on top. The goal was not comfort, but survival, a barrier between the body and the biting cold outside. The villagers prepared as best they could. They collected firewood all autumn, but it was never enough. Trees were valuable, and cutting them down required permission from the lord of the land. Dead branches, wind-fallen, limbs and brush were gathered, dried, and stored in small piles beneath eaves or in barns. Even animal dung, when dried, could be burned as fuel, a practice born of sheer necessity. The cold also shaped their days. Work was done quickly, in bursts, with frequent returns to the hearth. Water was drawn in the morning, before it froze solid, and animals were tended in small, cramped barns, where their body heat helped keep the space above freezing. Men and women moved briskly, knowing that to stop was to invite the chill deep into their bones. Even the church played a role in keeping warm. On feast days or holy gatherings, the village would come together inside the stone church, huddled for warmth in the presence of others. The flicker of candles and the press of bodies created a shared heat, a brief respite from the relentless cold outside. Food, too, helped ward off the chill. Hot pottage, simple though it was, filled the stomach and spread warmth from within. A sip of ale or mead might bring a blush to cold cheeks, though such luxuries were rare. The peasants knew that keeping the body fed was as important as keeping it covered. The seasons turned slowly, and the cold lingered. Each day was a small victory, a quiet triumph over the frost. Thomas and Mary, like their neighbors, endured by clinging to their small rituals. The cold night had fallen over the village like a heavy blanket. The stars shone faintly in the velvet sky, their pale light barely enough to outline the dark shapes of thatched roofs and bare skeletal trees. The wind whispered through the empty lanes, carrying the scent of wood smoke and frost. It was a night when the cold seemed to seep into the bones, and the darkness felt endless. Yet even in this stillness, there was a presence, soft footsteps crunching in the snow, a lantern's faint glow, the quiet murmur of a watchman's breath. In the heart of the village, as others huddled beneath their blankets, a few souls braved the cold to keep watch. It was a task born of necessity, of fear, and of a shared understanding that the darkness could hold dangers as well as dreams. Thomas, bundled in a heavy cloak and a woolen cap, stood near the edge of the village square. His breath hung in the air like a ghostly cloud. His lantern's light cast a small circle of warmth in the dark, though it did little to chase away the chill that bit at his fingertips and crept down his spine. Beside him, old Gerald leaned on a crooked staff, his face barely visible beneath the thick folds of his scarf. They had drawn straws earlier that evening, and the two of them were chosen to take the first watch. Thomas had tried not to groan when the straw fell to him, but he knew it was fair. They all took turns, for no one wanted to face the long night alone. The village lay quiet under the stars. From the shadows of cottages, smoke curled slowly into the sky, a sign of life and warmth within. Occasionally, the sound of a baby's cry drifted faintly on the breeze, or the low, rhythmic snore of animals in their pens. Otherwise, the night was silent to silent. Perhaps the watchman's task was simple. Keep the fires burning low but steady. Make sure no embers from the hearths caught the thatch and set the village ablaze. Watch the paths leading into the village for travelers or troublemakers, for wolves that might prowl too close, or worse, bandits who might seek easy prey in the quiet hours. Thomas shifted from foot to foot, trying to keep warm. "Do you think they'll come tonight?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Gerald grunted, his breath misting in the air. Bandits, wolves, cold eye, one of them will surely visit. It's only a matter of time. It was a grim truth. They all knew. The cold had a way of driving men to desperation, and desperate men could be dangerous. Food was scarce, wood was scarcer, and in times like these, it wasn't uncommon for starving men to steal from their neighbors or worse. The night watch wasn't just a tradition, it was survival. The flickering lanterns along the village's edge were both warning and welcome, a sign to outsiders that someone was awake. Someone was watching. Thomas took a slow, deep breath, his lungs stinging from the cold. He let his eyes drift over the snowy fields beyond, where the dark trees swayed gently in the wind. Somewhere out there, foxes prowled, owls hunted, and the frost crept in shadows. The moon hung low, its light, thin and pale, casting long, eerie shadows across the ground. Hours passed, measured by the slow dripping of melted wax from the lantern, by the quiet ticking of Thomas's heart, by the soft rustling of straw beneath. The snow, they spoke little, only the occasional murmured word, still cold. How's your lantern? Running low. Inside the cottages, families lay curled together for warmth. Mothers pressed children close, fathers tucked blankets tighter, the elderly whispered prayers for safety. They trusted the watchman to keep them safe, to stay vigilant through the bitter hours until dawn. As midnight approached, Thomas's eyelids grew heavy, but he forced himself to stay alert. He remembered the tales how once, long ago, a fire had swept through the village while the watchman slept. How wolves had taken a lamb from the pen. How a stranger, wrapped in a dark cloak, had slipped into a cottage and vanished with a sack of bread. The stories were old, but they lived in the minds of the villagers like faint shadows. And so, Thomas stayed awake, his fingers wrapped around the hilt of the old rusty knife at his side, the lantern's flame a small, defiant glow against the darkness. The hours dragged on. The cold deepened. Thomas stamped his feet, tried to hum a song softly to himself, tried to think of spring, the green fields, the warm sun, the sweet scent of flowers. But the cold was insistent, wrapping around him like an icy shroud. Then, a sound of faint crunching in the snow, just beyond the far fence. Thomas stiffened, heart racing, as he strained his eyes into the darkness. Gerald turned, squinting, his staff held tight. A dark shape moved slowly, too large to be a fox, too quiet for a man. Thomas's hand went to his knife. The lantern light flickered across the shape, revealing a pair of gleaming eyes, a low growl. A wolf dot, it stood there, watching them, its breath steaming in the cold air. For a long moment, it was a standoff to watchmen. Two men alone, in the vast cold, and a creature driven by hunger. Gerald tapped his staff on the ground, shouting hoarsely. Thomas raised his lantern high, the light casting long, trembling shadows. Across the snow, the wolf hesitated, its ears flat, tail low. Then, with a snarl, it turned and slunk back into the darkness, disappearing between the trees. Thomas exhaled slowly, his heart still pounding. Gerald clapped him on the shoulder. "You did well, lad. That's why we keep watch." As dawn crept closer, the cold began to lift ever so slightly. The first faint blush of pink touched the horizon, and the village began to stir. The watch was nearly over, and Thomas, exhausted but alive, knew they had made it through another night. Together, they returned to their homes, their hearts heavy with the weight of the long hours, but lightened by the knowledge that they had kept their village safe. If only for one more night, the cycle would repeat night after night. Watch after watch until the frost melted, The snow turned to mud, and spring brought warmth back to the land. But for now, Thomas and Gerald slept, knowing they had done their part, and in the quiet, cold darkness, the village dreamed on. As the dusk faded into the deep indigo of night, the small medieval village settled into a hush. The crackling of the large bonfire in the center of the village square was the only sound that seemed alive, its flames dancing softly against the chill that crept in from the forests. The peasants gathered, wrapped in their thickest wool cloaks and scarves, their breath forming small clouds in the cold air. It had been a long day of toil mending fences, harvesting what little remained in the fields, and ensuring the animals were safe in the barns. The fire, tonight, was not just a source of warmth, but a place of gathering, a quiet celebration of community, resilience, and the simple pleasure of shared company. They had no grand feasts, no luxurious comforts, but they had each other, old Thomas. The village storyteller took his place near the fire, leaning on a gnarled walking stick. His voice, rough yet warm, like a worn blanket, began to weave tales of kings and queens, of distant lands, of forgotten heroes. The children, wide-eyed and wrapped in their mother's arms, listened as if the flickering flames brought the characters to life. They imagined knights in gleaming armor and dragons lurking beyond the hills. Even the elders, tired from the day's labors, smiled at the familiar stories. Nearby, the village cook, Eleanor, handed out small bowls of warm broth. It was thin, flavored with only a hint of herbs, but it was hot, and that made all the difference. The warmth seeped into chilled fingers, into tired bones, offering a moment of comfort. The firelight shimmered on faces lined with age and experience, the marks of countless winters endured. They had learned to appreciate the small joys, the way the fire crackled, the way the stars twinkled above, the simple act of sharing a story. Thomas's tale that night was about a shepherd boy who had braved the coldest night in the mountains, surviving with nothing but his wits, a sturdy cloak, and the kindness of a passing stranger. As he spoke, the villagers nodded, recognizing the wisdom in his words, the value of kindness, the strength in community, and the power of simple courage. Somewhere, in the darkness beyond the firelight, the wolves howled, but no one flinched. The village, their small world, felt safe under the watchful stars. The fire, though small, was a beacon against the vast cold. And in that moment, no one was alone. The night wore on, and slowly the fire dimmed. People began to drift away, bidding soft good nights as they headed to their simple huts, each carrying the warmth of the fire within them. The children, now asleep in their parents' arms, would dream of brave heroes and cozy firesides. And as the last embers glowed faintly, The village slept, safe and snug, against the coldest night. The fire may have dimmed, but its memory would burn bright in their hearts. Just another night, another winter, survived together. As the dusk faded into the deep indigo of night, the small medieval village settled into a hush. The crackling of the large bonfire in the center of the village square was the only sound that seemed alive, its flames dancing softly against the chill that crept in from the forests. The peasants gathered, wrapped in their thickest wool cloaks and scarves, their breath forming small clouds in the cold air. It had been a long day of toil mending fences, harvesting what little remained in the fields, and ensuring the animals were safe in the barns. The fire, tonight, was not just a source of warmth, but a place of gathering, a quiet celebration of community, resilience, and the simple pleasure of shared company. They had no grand feasts, no luxurious comforts, but they had each other. Old Thomas, the village storyteller, took his place near the fire, leaning on a gnarled walking stick. His voice, rough, yet warm like a worn blanket, began to weave tales of kings and queens, of distant lands, of forgotten heroes. The children, wide-eyed and wrapped in their mother's arms, listened as if the flickering flames brought the characters to life. They imagined knights in gleaming armor and dragons lurking beyond the hills. Even the elders, tired from the day's labors, smiled at the familiar stories. Nearby, the village cook, Eleanor, handed out small bowls of warm broth. It was thin, flavored with only a hint of herbs, but it was hot, and that made all the difference. The warmth seeped into chilled fingers, into tired bones, offering a moment of comfort. The firelight shimmered on faces lined with age and experience, the marks of countless winters endured. They had learned to appreciate the small joys, the way the fire crackled, the way the stars twinkled above, the simple act of sharing a story. Thomas's tale that night was about a shepherd boy who had braved the coldest night in the mountains, surviving with nothing but his wits, a sturdy cloak, and the kindness of a passing stranger. As he spoke, the villagers nodded, recognizing the wisdom in his words, the value of kindness, the strength in community, and the power of simple courage. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the firelight, the wolves howled, but no one flinched. The village, their small world, felt safe under the watchful stars. The fire, though small, was a beacon against the vast cold, and in that moment, no one was alone. The night wore on, and slowly the fire dimmed. People began to drift away, bidding soft good nights as they headed to their simple huts, each carrying the warmth of the fire within them. The children, now asleep in their parents' arms, would dream of brave heroes and cozy firesides. and as the last embers glowed faintly, the village slept, safe and snug, against the coldest night. The fire may have dimmed, but its memory would burn bright in their hearts. Just another night. Another winter survived together. Asterisk, how the peasants endured the unyielding frost. The heart of winter had arrived in the village, and with it, a cold so fierce that it seemed to seep into the very stones of the cottages. The nights grew longer, the days shorter, and each moment felt like a test of endurance. For the peasants, survival had become a quiet, desperate daily struggle against hunger, cold, and exhaustion. Thomas rose before dawn, as he had done every day of the long winter. The air inside the cottage was so cold that the water in a clay jug had frozen solid. His breath fogged in front of his face, and he shivered as he wrapped his worn woolen cloak tighter around his shoulders. Eliza lay beside the children, holding them close for warmth, their faces pale and drawn. The fire had burned out overnight, and Thomas knew they could not waste precious wood. Each log was a treasure, gathered slowly from the sparse woods nearby. He carefully fed the small flames, coaxing life back into the hearth. The fire a small defiance against the cold. Food was scarcely so scarce that each meal was rationed carefully, each bite a blessing. The villagers had taken to boiling bones for broth, stretching out the last remnants of meat. Bread was hard and stale, yet each piece was cherished. They ate in silence, savoring the warmth the food brought. However fleeting, work never stopped, even in the cruelest of weather. Thomas joined the other men to mend fences, patch roofs, and tend to the animals. The livestock, too, suffered. Thin cows gave little milk, the chickens stopped laying, and the old draft horse struggled to stand in the icy mornings. Frostbite claimed more than a few toes and fingers that season. The village healer, an elderly woman named Agnes, did what she could with herbs and poultices, but her supplies were running low. When a child fell ill with a fever, the entire village held its breath, whispering prayers into the night air, praying for survival. Yet, even in the deepest cold, life continued. Thomas's youngest, a bright-eyed boy named William, found a small joy in carving shapes into the frost that covered the windows. The simple art lifted the spirits of the family, if only for a moment. Eliza mended clothes by the firelight, her fingers nimble despite the cold, and sang soft lullabies that seemed to chase away the darkness. One evening, as the snow fell in thick, heavy flakes, the village gathered in the small church at the edge of the woods. The priest, Father Edmund, spoke softly about hope, about the coming of spring, and about the strength of the human spirit. Candles flickered in the dark, their warm glow casting gentle shadows on weary faces. Together, the villagers sang soft, trembling melody that echoed through the rafters and seemed to warm the cold air around them. That night, Thomas walked home slowly, his boots crunching through the snow. He looked up at the dark sky, where stars shimmered faintly behind clouds, and he felt a quiet determination settle in his chest. They would survive this winter, somehow. They had no other choice. As he reached the cottage, he paused for a moment, listening to the muffled sounds of his family inside, the soft murmur of Eliza's voice, the crackle of the fire, the gentle breathing of his children, the small, humble sounds of life. A reminder that, even in the coldest, darkest times, they had each other. The winter was not over. The hardest days were still ahead, but Thomas knew they would face them together, one frozen day at a time. The village lay under a thick blanket of snow, white and unbroken, stretching endlessly across the fields. The silence of winter was heavy only. The occasional caw of a distant crow or the creak of a frozen tree branch broke the stillness. For the peasants, this quiet was not peace, but a reminder of the hardships they faced. Inside Thomas and Eliza's cottage, the cold seemed to seep through the very walls. The fire crackled low, barely enough to warm the room. The family huddled close, sharing body heat beneath patched blankets. Thomas watched the flames dance, lost in thought. His hands were rough and cracked, his joints aching from days of labor. In the bitter cold, each breath felt like a weight, each movement an effort. Eliza, ever resourceful, had taken to mending old clothes, stitching patches over patches until the fabric was more thread than cloth. She worked quietly, her fingers moving with practiced care, while their children sat close, drawing pictures in the frost that formed on the window pane. The children's laughter, though faint, brought a fleeting sense of warmth, a small light. In the oppressive cold, outside, the men of the village gathered for their daily meeting. They spoke in hushed tones about dwindling food stores, about the animals that had not survived the frost, and about the sickness creeping through their homes. Old John, the village elder, spoke of past winters, of how the people had endured by relying on each other, by sharing what little they had. His voice, though cracked with age, carried a strength that the others leaned on. Thomas volunteered to join the wood-collecting party the next day. It was a dangerous task, venturing into the forest, where the snow was deep and the wind unforgiving. Yet they needed firewood. Without it, families would freeze. As he prepared his axe and wrapped a scarf tightly around his face, Eliza watched him with worry in her eyes, though she said nothing. Words seemed too heavy, too sharp, in the biting cold. That night, as the family lay down to sleep, Thomas whispered softly to Eliza, "We'll make it through. We have to." His voice was low-edged with both hope and exhaustion. Eliza nodded, her eyes glistening in the dim light, and squeezed his hand. The next day, the wood-collecting party trudged into the forest, the snow crunching under their boots. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their bare branches reaching skyward like frozen fingers. They worked methodically, chopping branches and fallen logs, the sound of axes ringing in the cold air. Each log they carried back was a victory, a small piece of survival. But as they returned to the village, Thomas noticed a change in the sky, a heavy gray blanket of clouds rolling in. The air felt thicker, heavier, as if the world itself was holding its breath. That night, the blizzard came, howling through the village like a wild beast. The wind slammed against the cottages, shaking the doors and rattling the shutters. Snow piled high, burying paths and fences, turning the familiar landscape into a white wasteland. Inside their cottage, Thomas and Eliza huddled with the children, the fire barely holding on against the storm's fury. The walls groaned, and the wind seeped in through every crack. The family stayed awake, too frightened to sleep, listening to the storm rage outside. Each gust of wind felt like a threat, each moment a test of their resolve. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed. The snow lay deep, the paths erased, the fields hidden beneath drifts taller than a man. It was beautiful, in a way sparkling and still, but also dangerous. A reminder of nature's indifference to human struggle. Thomas knew they had survived the storm, but winter was not over. The cold remained, the hunger gnawed, and the work continued. Yet in their hearts, they carried a quiet, unspoken strength, the determination to see each day through, no matter how hard. And so, they endured. The long bitter winter was finally showing signs of relenting. The air, though still cold, carried a softness whisper of the warmer days to come. For the peasants of the village, it was a moment of cautious hope. The snowbanks, which had once loomed like walls, had begun to shrink. Patches of dark earth peeked through, revealing the promise hidden beneath months of cold. Inside the cottage, Thomas stood by the window, gazing out at the thawing landscape. His breath fogged the glass, and he drew a small circle with his finger. Outside, the trees swayed gently in the breeze, their branches still bare, but no longer bowed under the weight of snow. He could hear the faint dripping of melting icicles, each drop a quiet reminder that the world was waking up. Eliza moved about the room, tidying up the space that had been their refuge during the harshest months. Her movements were lighter, her face carrying a subtle glow. The children were restless, eager to run outside, their laughter bubbling with energy that had been bottled up all winter. Thomas and the other men of the village gathered once again, this time with a different energy, one of planning and preparation. There was talk of planting, of fixing tools worn down by months of heavy use, of clearing debris left by the storms. The older men spoke of the importance of patience, of waiting until the ground was ready, but even they could not hide the hope in their voices. One afternoon, as the sun hung lower in the sky, Thomas walked through the village square. He paused to admire the first signs of green, tiny blades of grass poking through the melting snow, like the faintest strokes of a new painting. He knelt down, running his fingers over the damp earth, feeling its cold but promising touch. It was a small moment, but it filled him with a quiet joy. The family prepared for the changing season. Eliza began sorting the remaining food stores, setting aside what little they had for seed. The children, under her watchful eye, helped patch the garden fence, their hands small but eager. Thomas repaired the tools, sharpening the edges of his spade, tightening the handles on the hoe. Each task felt like a prayer for the days ahead, a commitment to the future. The nights were still cold, and the fire still burned low, but there was a different feeling in the air. The stars seemed brighter, the sky clearer, as if nature itself was exhaling after a long, hard winter. Thomas and Eliza sat together by the fire, their hands entwined, watching the flames dance. "We made it," Thomas whispered, his voice soft but filled with wonder. Eliza smiled, her eyes shining with tears that she quickly blinked away. They both knew the challenges were not over. Spring would bring its own trials, but they had endured the worst. And that knowledge was its own kind of comfort. As dawn broke on the first truly warm day, the village awoke to the sound of birdsong. The sun rose higher, casting long golden rays across the fields. The children ran outside, their laughter ringing through the air. Thomas watched them, his heart full, knowing that this was what they had fought for, the chance to see life bloom again. And as the first seeds were planted in the thawed earth, the villagers worked side by side, their faces turned to the sun. The long winter was behind them, but its lessons remained. They had learned that survival was not just about food and firewood, but about resilience, about leaning on each other, about finding hope in the darkest days. The season had turned, and with it, so had the hearts of the people. They knew that more challenges lay ahead, but for now, they could breathe, smile, and look forward to the warmth of the coming days. As the sun set over the fields, Thomas whispered a quiet thanks to the earth, the sky, and the unseen forces that had carried them through. The stars shimmered above, a silent promise that life, like the seasons, would continue.